Dean Martin had sung to rooms filled with smoke and secrets for 20 years. But on a humid August night in 1963, at the Copa Room of the Sands Hotel, something happened that would never make the papers. It wasn't filmed, it wasn't recorded, but those who were there, the waiters balancing champagne, the couples celebrating anniversaries, the bartenders who'd seen everything, would remember it as the night Dean Martin reminded them that some silences are louder than any song. The Copa Room was Las Vegas aristocracy, red velvet walls, crystal chandeliers that threw light like scattered diamonds, tables arranged in perfect sight lines to a stage that had held Sinatra, had held Sammy, had held every voice that mattered in American entertainment. That night, Dean was 3 songs into his second set. The crowd was his, warm, responsive, expensive. These weren't tourists. These were the people who lived in Las Vegas or flew in specifically to see him. Women in gowns that cost more than most Americans made in a month. Men who conducted business between martinis and never raised their voices because they never had to. Dean was singing Volare. His voice floated across the room like smoke, easy, unforced, seemingly effortless. This was the Dean Martin everyone expected, relaxed, charming, slightly drunk though he rarely was, making every person in that room feel like he was singing specifically to them. The ice in glasses settled, cigarettes burned down to filters, and somewhere in the third row, a man in a gray suit was about to change everything. The man had been drinking since dinner, not enough to be ejected. The Sands didn't eject men who looked like money, but enough to loosen whatever governed his daylight behavior. Dean was coming to the crescendo of Volare, that soaring moment where his voice would climb and the orchestra would swell, and the audience would lean forward despite themselves. The spotlight held him in a perfect circle of white light. His tuxedo was immaculate. His hands moved with the music, conducting an invisible orchestra of memory and longing. And then the man spoke. One word, sharp, ugly, a word that had no place in that room, in any room, but especially not there, not then, not while Dean Martin was singing about flying and freedom and the kind of joy that transcends language. The word was directed at a young couple, 2 tables over. The woman was wearing a gold dress. The man beside her had his hand on hers. They were celebrating something, an engagement perhaps, or an anniversary. They were the only black couple in the room. The word cut through the music like glass through silk. Dean's voice stopped mid-phrase, not a fade, not a conclusion, just stopped, as if someone had lifted a needle from a record. The orchestra, confused, continued for 3 more beats before Vincent Roselli, the conductor who'd worked with Dean for 6 years, raised his hand and brought them to silence. In the entertainment world of 1963, there were rules, unwritten but understood. When someone in the audience said something inappropriate, you ignored it. You sang louder. You made a joke. You moved on. The show, as they said, must go on. Everyone in that room knew the script. The performer continues. The disruption passes. Tomorrow, no one remembers the ugliness, only the songs. Dean Martin had followed these rules for 2 decades. He'd sung through heckling in Cleveland, through fights in Atlantic City, through moments when the room was more interested in their arguments than his artistry. He was a professional. Professionals didn't stop. But Dean stood there, microphone loose in his hand, looking at the man in the gray suit, not staring, just looking, the way you might look at something broken that you're deciding whether to fix or throw away. The couple at their table hadn't moved. The woman's hand had tightened on her clutch. The man beside her sat with the kind of stillness that comes from a lifetime of calculating the cost of response. The room waited. 300 people, suspended between one breath and the next. Waiters stood frozen mid-step. A woman's hand stopped halfway to her cigarette case. Even the smoke seemed to hang motionless in the air. They waited for Dean to do what Dean always did. Make it smooth, make it easy, make it disappear beneath charm, and another song. But Dean didn't move. 10 seconds passed. In a nightclub, 10 seconds of silence is an eternity. It's long enough for discomfort to bloom into something else. Long enough for everyone to understand that this wasn't a technical problem or a forgotten lyric. This was a choice. Dean set the microphone back in its stand. The click it made, metal against metal, rang out across the silent room like a judge's gavel. He walked to the piano at stage left. His footsteps were audible. Everything was audible in that terrible silence. The piano bench creaked slightly as he sat. He placed his hands on his knees, and he waited. The man in the gray suit shifted in his chair. The leather groaned. "Come on, Dean," someone called out from the back, nervous, trying to break the spell. "Sing something." Dean didn't respond. He sat at the piano, back straight, hands still. He might have been a photograph except for the slight rise and fall of his shoulders as he breathed. The couple, the targets of that word, hadn't moved. But something in the woman's posture had changed. She'd lifted her chin, just slightly, just enough. Vincent Roselli, the conductor, would later tell his wife that he'd never seen anything like it. Dean had this way, he'd say, of making his silence feel like action. The man in the gray suit laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from discomfort, masquerading as confidence. "What? You forget the words," he called out. Dean stood, slowly, deliberately. He walked back to the microphone, and for a moment, the room exhaled. He was going to continue. The strange moment would pass. The world would return to its axis. But instead of singing, Dean spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying that same easy warmth that had sold millions of records. "I seem to have developed a sudden case of not being able to hear my music over the sound of someone forgetting their manners." A nervous titter ran through the crowd. Dean continued, still pleasant, still calm. "Now I've sung in a lot of rooms, beautiful rooms, ugly rooms, rooms where the only applause came from the rats in the walls, a few more laughs, slightly more confident. But in all those rooms I've found that the music sounds best when everyone remembers we're here to share something good." He paused, let his eyes drift across the audience, stopping just for a moment on the couple in gold and black. "So here's what's going to happen," Dean said. "I'm going to start over, and we're all going to pretend the last few minutes didn't happen. Because that's what decent people do. They give each other the chance to be better than their worst moment." The man in the gray suit started to speak, but the woman beside him, his wife presumably, placed a hand on his arm. Whatever she whispered made him close his mouth. Dean turned to Vincent and nodded. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestra inhaled collectively, and Dean began to sing. But not volare. He sang, "I've got you under my skin," and he sang it differently than he'd ever sung it before. Slower, heavier, like he was excavating each word from somewhere deep. The couple in gold and black stayed for the entire set. When Dean finished, they stood to leave. As they passed the stage, the man nodded to Dean, just once, a small gesture that carried the weight of dignity, acknowledged, dignity maintained. Dean nodded back. The man in the gray suit had left during the third song, pulling his wife behind him, their exit barely noticed except by those paid to notice such things. But something had changed in the Copa room that night. The audience applauded differently, not louder, but longer, as if they were applauding not just the performance, but the permission Dean had given them to expect better of their shared spaces. 3 weeks later, Dean would sing at the March on Washington, not on the main stage. That was for the speakers, the leaders, the voices of change, but at a small gathering the night before, in a church basement where organizers and supporters gathered to prepare for what they knew would be history. He never spoke publicly about the night at the Sands. When asked why he'd agreed to sing at the March preparation, he'd simply said, "Sometimes you've got to sing where it matters." Those who were at the Copa room that night would carry the memory differently. For some, it was the night they saw Dean Martin stop being a performer and start being a person. For others, it was a reminder that silence in the face of ugliness was its own kind of participation. The young couple in gold and black, their names were William and Dorothy Henderson, would return to the Sands 2 months later. Dean wasn't performing, but the maitre d'alf recognized them. Their dinner was complimentary. Their champagne was the good stuff. A note was delivered with dessert. It said simply, "The music sounds better with you here. DM." Years would pass, the Copa room would close, the Sands would be demolished, Las Vegas would transform from mob playground to corporate destination. The rules that governed those smoky rooms would seem quaint, almost innocent, compared to what came after. But those who were there, the witnesses to that humid August night, would remember it when they heard Dean's voice on the radio. They'd remember the sound of his footsteps across the stage, the click of the microphone being set in its stand, the terrible necessary silence that followed. They'd remember that Dean Martin, a man who'd built his career on making everything look easy, had shown them that some things weren't supposed to be easy. Some things were supposed to stop you in your tracks. Some things were supposed to make you set down the microphone and refuse to sing until the room remembered what music was for. Vincent Roselli kept conducting until night. In his final interview, a young journalist asked him about the greatest performance he'd ever witnessed. He thought for a long moment before answering. Dean Martin, he said. The Copa Room, August 1963. What did he sing? The journalist asked. Vincent smiled. That's the thing, he said. The most important part was when he didn't. Silence. Dean Martin had taught them all that night, wasn't the absence of sound. Sometimes it was the presence of everything that mattered. Sometimes the most powerful moment in a performance is when the performance stops. And sometimes, in rooms filled with smoke and secrets, a man setting down a microphone can sound like revolution.